you could do that, we would appreciate it. Mr. Rauh, let's start with you.
Thank you very much, Chairman Coble, members of the subcommittee. The condition of state and local pension systems and the risks that these systems pose for federal taxpayers is a critical aspect of our nation's fiscal challenges. Pensions have become more than a means by which state and local governments provide retirement income for public employees. They have become a pervasive tool for circumventing balanced budget requirements. The mechanism is simple. State and local governments have promised pensions to employees without setting aside adequate funds. The bill is then left to future taxpayers when the employees retire. By that time, the politicians who made the promises are out of office. In some cases, the bills will be so large that state and local governments will likely seek substantial federal assistance. The Government Accounting Standards Board, GASB, has been complicit in this hidden borrowing by allowing a flawed accounting of these promises. Under GASB rules, state and local governments have around $1 trillion of unfunded pension liabilities. Using valuations consistent with financial economics, Professor Robert Novi-Marks and I have calculated that the already promised part of these unfunded liabilities amounts to over $3 trillion. GASB treats the returns on risky assets as though they were riskless and certain. The government assumes that the actual return will be identical to the targeted return, most commonly 8%, ignoring the fact that if the assets do not return 8%, the taxpayers are on the hook for the downside. GASB confounds the measurement of the amount of debt with the government's risky plans for repaying the debt. Consider how this would work if you could apply it to a federal bond issue. Suppose you issued $1 trillion of 10-year bonds, and suppose further that you spent half the proceeds immediately and put the other half in a fund invested in stocks and bonds, hoping that it would grow to repay the debt in 10 years. Well, obviously the government has a new debt of $1 trillion and new unfunded liabilities of $500 billion. But under GASB logic, the government could claim that since the expected return on their portfolio is 8%, there was actually no unfunded liability. This would be a way to deal with a $1.65 trillion budget deficit at the federal level. You could just borrow another $1.65 trillion invested in stocks and bonds, claim that it will have an expected return of 8%. And under GASB rules, that would be okay. This is hidden debt, debt that will eventually force governments to choose among a group of unpalatable options, slashing public services, dramatically raising taxes, attempting to cut benefits, defaulting on debt, or seeking a federal bailout. Many pension systems are approaching a day of reckoning. Even assuming 8% returns, the assets of the systems in 7 states and 6 big cities would be insufficient to pay for today's already promised benefits past 2020. And what this means is that substantial contributions to the funds will be needed over the next decade to pay for legacy liabilities. Some state governments are taking steps to address the issue, but many are going in the opposite direction. So, for example, by statute or by contract, many major public pension funds in Illinois do not contribute anywhere near the amount required to pay new costs and to begin to pay down unfunded liabilities. The California State Teachers Retirement System contributed only 55% of the recommended amount in 2010, even by GASB standards, and New Jersey made only 5% of the recommended contributions to its state police and teachers funds. Now, if states perceive implicit federal backing, they may lack the incentives to undertake reforms of these systems. So I would argue that Congress should limit the liability of federal taxpayers by providing states with those incentives. It should condition the availability of federal money on pension reforms that limit off-balance sheet borrowing. In particular, the Public Employee Pension Transparency Act, H.R. 567, would be a very useful step. It would condition federal tax benefits on disclosure by the states of the true financial value of these unfunded public pension promises. The bill establishes an incentive. If states want federal subsidies, then they may not engage in off-balance sheet borrowing through improperly valued pension liabilities. Congress should consider further incentives-based approaches, both carrots and sticks, particularly if the idea of a state bankruptcy code is not going to be pursued. One approach would relate to the tax treatment of bonds that could be used to fund pensions. In a plan I developed with Professor Novi-Marks, a state would be allowed to issue tax-subsidized bonds for the purposes of pension funding if and only if it agreed to specific austerity measures, including closing its defined benefit plans to new workers, enrolling all new employees in a defined contribution plan, plus Social Security. The cost savings from the new Social Security enrollment would offset a large portion of the costs from the debt subsidy. So in sum, I would say that urgent action at the federal level is required to ensure that federal taxpayers will not be the ultimate underwriters of state debts. The most useful action would be the establishment of financial incentives that encourage states not to gamble with the money of federal taxpayers. This is a $3 trillion problem, and the question is just simply how that $3 trillion is going to be divided up among state taxpayers and federal taxpayers and other claimants. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rauh.